Okay, so I think everybody has joined who's present, and those of us who are still coming in will connect as they are able. So bonsoir, messieurs et mesdames. Good evening and welcome to all.
Zganagoaga Uchida Jarasuna, which in Mohawk means, how are you? Are you in good mind, my dear friends? With this, we acknowledge that the Thomas More Institute is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Ganegeha people are recognized as the custodians of the land and waters we now call Montreal. Joachaqua, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is the home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community.
So again, welcome, bienvenue. My name is Jonathan Powers. I am the academic director of the Thomas More Institute, which is our host for this evening. I'm going to be the MC for this evening's interview with Professor Jason Opal concerning the recent US elections and their ramifications for the world, for democracy, for the United States, and for Canada. In just a few moments, I'm going to introduce everyone else who's visible on your screen. But first, as they used to say on television, a few words from our sponsor. So I'm going to tell you that the Thomas More Institute, which I'm going to refer to as TMI for brevity's sake, is a charitable, secular, academic institution that offers university-level courses for adults. Most of our courses are given in a seminar format, and our courses differ from the courses that are offered elsewhere, typically at mainstream universities, in that the participants at TMI are invited to cooperate in a process of shared inquiry and reflection. And that is quite self-conscious and deliberate, that invitation to participate. We do not attempt to establish the meaning or importance of texts or concepts. Rather, we seek to illuminate issues through questions. And so we seek to improve our questions so that they spark curiosity and that they provoke all of the participants to generate new connections in their own understanding. And one way that we might sum this up is to say that we at TMI strive to generate conversations that matter. Conversations that reach farther, that go deeper, that connect more. Maybe conversations like those you may remember with some of your close friends that went long into the night. Conversations that matter are what we are all about. And so with that in mind, I'm going to give you just a few words so that you have a roadmap for this evening's interview. So after these introductory remarks, I'm going to introduce the two interviewers and Professor Opal. So Brian McDonough, Carol Fiedler, and Jason Opal. Professor Opal is going to give an overview of key questions or problematics that will form the kind of the core of our discussion for this evening. Although, of course, since it's a conversation, there's going to be a bit of a centrifugal action. It's natural that we're going to stray, but we're going to try to come back to some of these key issues. That interview is going to last about an hour. Afterwards, we're going to transition to questions and answers from the audience, and that is an extremely important part of this evening. And after that, there'll be a few very brief closing remarks. So contingencies for internet issues, we all know by this time that all of us need to go out and buy a t-shirt that has the two mottos for 2020 on it. And number one has got to be, you're on mute, followed very closely by, I'm having internet issues. So if anybody who's up here has internet issues and we lose connectivity, we are just going to keep moving ahead. That's one of the reasons that we have a few people up here. And even if Professor Opal himself disappears, please know that somebody behind the scenes will be helping him to get back as expeditiously as possible. So don't leave, just stay tuned, bear with us a little bit, and we will get back on track. So back to the question and answers section of the evening. This is really important. We believe in questions at the Institute, and we want to hear your questions, the audience's questions. So if you mouse down, if you're using a computer, if you mouse down to the bottom, and if you're using a tablet, if you touch your screen and that Zoom toolbar pops up, you'll see a Q&A section there, a Q&A button that you can push. You can enter a question at any moment, and we encourage you to do so. So if something strikes you and you find yourself reflecting on it, please take a few moments, compose a really good question, and go ahead and put it in there. And that will queue it up for the Q&A section. I want to mention right now that all the questions are going to pass through me. So I will do my best to connect them to issues that have already gone or to clarify if necessary. But one of the things that this is going to entail, since we expect quite a few questions, is that we're not going to get to all of them. So if we don't get to your question, I want to apologize both for the group, for the Institute, and personally, I'm sorry that we didn't get to your question. We want to get to everybody's question, but there simply isn't time. Now, with that in mind, 2 words on the questions. The first is that one key value at the Institute is openness. And all of us up here and everybody at the Institute, we are all in agreement that we want an open forum. Professor Opal has said specifically he's going to take all questions. We are here to listen to ideas that are not our own. Another aspect that I want to draw your attention to of the conversation and the questions is TMI's value of mutual respect. So although we kind of expect there to be a certain level of disagreement, we're going to have different positions. That's what makes a conversation interesting. We are asking everybody to maintain a respectful tone. So please, when you pose your question, just pose it with respect. That's all that we're asking. And now I'm going to pass to introductions. So the first person that I'm going to introduce, so this is kind of the Zoom equivalent of standing up while you're introduced, is Carol Fiedler. Carol, if you could just give the camera a wave, please. Carol was born and raised in the United States, so she is an American by upbringing, and she follows US politics avidly. She holds a master's degree and a doctorate in political theory, and both from the University of Chicago. She is currently TMI's, the chair of TMI's board of directors, and she is a member of the curriculum committee, which handles academic affairs at the Institute. Now, Brian McDonough. So Brian, I'm going to ask you to give a little wave to the camera and to everybody here. Brian is a native Montrealer. He obtained a bachelor's in communication arts from Loyola College, which is now a part of Concordia University. After which he lived and worked in France and in India for some time, so he was abroad. When he came back, he took a BCL and an LLB from McGill University. So those of you who are not Canadians, those are law degrees. And so he was called to the Quebec bar in 1984. He also holds a master's in theology from Concordia University. From 1995 to 2018, he was the director of the Social Action Office for the Catholic Archdiocese of Montreal. He's currently a member of TMI's board of directors, and he teaches at Concordia University and at l'Université de Laval. And now to introduce our guest for this evening, Jason Opal. So Jason, if you could just give a little wave here. Professor Opal was born and raised in the United States, so yet another American. He's now settled here in Montreal with his family. He's currently the chair of the History and Classical Studies Department at McGill University. I'm just going to read a very small number of the titles of some of his recent publications to give you an idea of his research and teaching interests. His most recent book is entitled Avenging the People, Andrew Jackson, The Rule of Law, and the American Nation. Those of you who are highly observant will notice that right over Brian's right shoulder, so the left on your screen, there's a copy of that book. So a title of an article, kind of a few articles and book chapters that will be indicative or representative: The Labors of Liberality, Christian Benevolence, and National Prejudice in the American Founding. Natural Rights and National Greatness, Economic Ideology and Social Policy in the American States, 1780s to 1820s. And Patriots No More, The Political Economy of Anglo-American Rapprochement, 1815 to 1846. And that particular title comes from, it's a chapter of a book, chapter in a book. The book's title is Revolutions Across the Borders, Jacksonian America and the Canadian Rebellion. So the Canadian angle I want to emphasize is going to be particularly important tonight. And then to indicate the direction of his current research, he's working toward a book with the tentative title of Most Noble Island, 3 Ages of Barbados in the Early Americas. And this is intended to be a global history of the tiny island, namely Barbados, that was at the center of American, European, African and Indian Ocean history from the 1600s to the 1800s. And an article that has come out of that research in the direction of the book that is under review, entitled Mastering Slavery, Mortality, Security, and the Imperial Nation of Barbados, 1641 to 1675. Professor Opal, welcome. Thank you so much for giving some of your time tonight, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. That lovely introduction, and thanks to all for zooming on this evening. I really appreciate it. So I would say that the last 3 weeks have brought to light two dramatic and profoundly interesting dimensions of American life. The first is really remarkable evidence that democratic, small d, democratic practices, democratic ideas, democratic habits, democratic ways of life run really deep in the United States and are alive and very well. This is evidenced in the huge turnout in this last general election. This is evidenced in, knocking on wood, and to the present day, the peaceful nature of the election itself, and even its somewhat chaotic result afterwards. This is evidence in the simple labors of poll workers and of ballot counters and of canvassers in non-glorious county buildings and municipal areas across the United States who simply did their job for the better part of a week, in some cases, under conditions of extreme stress during a raging pandemic. This is evidence throughout American culture and American life, a kind of broad, organic, undeniable sort of statement that democracy runs deep and is alive and well. We also have evidence that American body politic, the American people, the American concept of a nation is profoundly divided, perhaps even paralyzed by incompatible rather than simply competing understandings of the nation itself, of the duties of citizenship, of the nature of citizenship, and above all, the definition of who is actually a real American. This part of the United States has, like all things, a particular history. It is, I think, not hyperbolic to say that at the present moment, the United States national concept faces a level of polarity and a level of conflict and a level of, frankly, hatred, mutual antagonism and recrimination that is not just on a kind of conceptual or academic level interesting and important to talk about, but as an American myself, frightening and distressing. So I would like to discuss, or if we can, those two dynamics, both of which I think are really powerful and really real. I'd like, if possible, to apply them in particular cases and see conflicting viewpoints on them. And I'd like also perhaps to reflect on, somewhat more practically about how Canadians, Quebecers, whether American or Canadian or not, can think about that, can think about the situation in which the United States finds itself, and apply lessons and take wisdom from what is happening in the United States in ways that will be concretely beneficial for the communities in which we live. So again, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to whatever questions come in.
Jason, let's unpack the recent American elections. Now, it seems that the presidency has changed, apparently, but for the down ballot races for the Senate, the House of Representatives, and perhaps more important, the Senate legislatures, there seems to have been little change. How should we, as Canadians, and also perhaps for Americans, think about that?
I would say that your overall analysis is exactly right, in the sense that what we basically saw on November 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, and a few days after that, was a huge outpouring of both the kind of diverse Democratic, capital D Democratic Party, and a very, very unified Republican Party, with neither side giving ground, in the sense, quite literally. So if one looks at county level election data, which is probably the best way to look, in my opinion, in American politics. Don't look at the states, look at the county level results. You find very little change from 2016. What you see instead is essentially that in a few places, most notably in the Great Lakes region and also the state of Georgia, a higher turnout, a quite remarkable turnout in the blue areas, in the Democratic areas, just pushed over the state itself against the red areas, which were equally, in some cases, even more red or Republican than in 2016. And this manifested down ballot in what appears to be a fairly a strong showing by the Republicans, who will most likely retain control of the Senate, although that is up for grabs in Georgia. That might very well be a 50-50 Senate. But the way I think we think about it is through this polarization, through this remarkable loyalty on one side with the Republicans, and on the other side a resurgent kind of alliance among the Democrats, makes for not necessarily a draw, but an extremely intense and close-run political situation in which political paralysis and simply the non-functioning of the American state is very, very possible.
Mm-hmm. You were alluding to the fact that the voter turnout for this election, over 152 million votes were cast in the middle of a pandemic, was really incredibly high. Does that speak to a healthy democracy, or does it rather speak more to the power of polarization, both augmented by the influence of the media, including social media? What generated that turnout?
Yeah, I think that in a lot of ways, and generally speaking, healthy democracies need to have strong turnout. Here again, if we look sort of a longer train of American history, the United States used to be well ahead of other Western countries, both in the nature of its sort of democratic practices and in many ways, and in its turnout. Turnout was routinely 70, 80, 90, in some cases over 100%. In elections in the United States in the 19th century, up through about the early 20th century, and then it's really started about a century of decline. Now, what drove this large sort of blip, or back to the future, or back to a century ago's turnout levels this time? I actually do not think that it's a matter of social media. I don't think it's a matter of a kind of a new healthiness of the democracy. I think it's entirely about Donald Trump, by which I mean the loyalty to Mr. Trump on one side, the extreme enthusiasm for voting for him among overwhelmingly Republican voters on the one side, and the profound contempt and disgust with Mr. Trump quite personally on the other side, that is on the much more sort of diverse, much more sort of difficult to hold together Democratic coalition on the other, explains this. And I'll just give one sort of statistic to back this up, or to sort of argue for this. Usually when you find the 2 months or so before the election, when there's some degree of reasonable prediction of what will occur, the losing side, or the side that appears to be on the losing end of things, generally reports, the voters tend to report less enthusiasm for their vote. And this often translates into a lower turnout. That was not at all the case here. And we found, in fact, right up into the election, when the polls once again were considerably off, especially in the upper Midwest, there was absolutely no decline in the enthusiasm for Republican voters for Mr. Trump. And that was matched on the other side by an unprecedented level of disgust for Mr. Trump by his opponents. And so these two forces, the polarization of America and the American national concept, and not, in my opinion, a resurgent health in the body politic, drove this turnout.
Yeah. Donald Trump did receive almost 74 million votes.
Yep.
That's a lot. Now, many Canadians, and I suggest a lot of Americans as well, wonder how Donald Trump, who has been able to secure such enthusiastic support of persons who normally most people would normally expect a high moral standard from their leaders. And Canadians, and I lost a lot of Americans, wonder how to explain the fact that this person who has public statements that seem to challenge, voters who have a high moral standard, how does he manage? How does he manage to garner 74 million votes? How is that possible?
I'd say one way to think of this is to consider that Mr. Trump is quite fluent in one language of American nationhood. He's quite good at referring to a conception of the United States as a group of people who are special and powerful and righteous and very often victimized by their own kindness. And however inaccurate that statement might seem, or that characterization of American people might sound, it doesn't make it less powerful as a resonant idea of the American nation. This national concept is, it is fair to say, overwhelmingly, although not exclusively, white. It also resonates much more strongly with evangelical Protestants than with other religious groups. So if one asks, what is the Trump coalition? There's been so many efforts to sort of try to dissect, disaggregate, but it's really quite simple. It's an alliance largely based on race and religion. And what is remarkable to me, perhaps more so than some of Mr. Trump's more crude statements and his ability to be extremely popular with so many voters, is that it does not appear that the COVID pandemic, and I'll simply say here, as objective as I want to be, or as impartial as I want to be, his objectively bad handling of the COVID pandemic does not appear to have hurt his re-election that much, except with a small number of moderates. So forgive me, it's a long answer to an important question.
Thank you.
I'm going to step in here because that answer goes to the heart of what I want to talk about with you next, which is the question of the politics of race in the United States. So we sent out when we sent out this invitation, we sent out some articles with it. And one of them was Ta-Nehisi Coates' article, which is provocatively entitled "The First White President," which is a discussion of Donald Trump. And I want to see I want to explore that a little bit with you. So there are basically three reasons. I'll summarize just in case some people haven't had the chance of reading it themselves. There are basically three reasons why he gives that provocative title, "The First White President." First of all, he says, a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, that if you're looking at someone who's completely unqualified for the job of the presidency, the only person who could succeed in getting that despite having no qualifications would be a white man. So that's in his first section. And then he goes on to say, that his campaign was based on the politics of race. So if you look just at his entrance into politics with the birtherism conspiracy, the charge that Barack Obama, with no evidence whatsoever, the charge that Barack Obama was actually born in Kenya and not in the United States, and therefore did not qualify to be president of the United States, that was itself an act of racism. When he came down that elevator and started his campaign, he began with his charges that Mexicans are rapists and these horrible immigrants and so forth. He spoke of his promise to ban Muslims. So there were many other instances, but the politics of race was a part of his campaign, Coates argues. And then finally, in the third section, Coates turns to the empirical data that political scientists looked at after the election. And he says, despite the fact that we hear only about poor white working class voters, actually, the statistics show that either a plurality or a majority of all whites up and down the economic ladder voted for Donald Trump. So I'm wondering, do you find Coates's argument persuasive? And how do you think that the politics of race played out in the 2016 election? So just talking about 2016 for now, we'll turn to 2020 soon.
Thanks for that. I largely agree with at least two of Coates' arguments. Maybe I'll take them in reverse order. The part that I like the most about Coates' article is this sort of frontal assault on this idea that Mr. Trump's base, so-called, or his voters are only or exclusively or generally those in places left behind by deindustrialization and neoliberalism. And that is the structure of that argument, is that only those of a certain race have a certain class. It's as if deindustrialization, liberalization of markets, NAFTA, very large-scale tax cuts weighted towards the wealthy, only hurt white male coal miners and not Black factory workers in places like Gary, Indiana, or the majority of the working class who are now women in service industries. It's a quite strange argument to make. It doesn't mean that it isn't true. So a way to put this is Donald Trump in a place like Pennsylvania did in fact clean up in the counties where the factories are long gone, places like southwestern Pennsylvania. He also won the 3 wealthiest counties in Florida, Georgia, and Ohio. These are counties that are not victims of neoliberalism. These are counties full of usually quite wealthy or prosperous, let's say, ex-urban voters, with a fair number of quite wealthy retirees. Again, the commonality is white racial background. So I really agree with him there. I agree in general with his analysis of the 2016 campaign. I will simply add that Mr. Trump, in addition to certainly speaking to racial resentment, white resentment, much more so than previous Republican presidents, it also should not be forgotten that he also is a fairly conventional Republican in other ways. In things like tax policy, he helped to pass a massive new tax in 2017, in particular sort of dislike of the administrative state and of regulations in general, and of course for very, very conservative, which is to say very much anti-labor judges. So, you know, he's all of those things, a traditional Republican, but with much more of a discourse of racial resentment. It's the last point about, you know, it can only be someone like a white male to sort of stumble into the White House. Coates is a brilliant stylist, and to have these lines where he'll say, you know, so Black Americans are often told, and we have to be twice as good, but the ulterior argument is much more compelling. Be half as good and get twice as much, and that only someone like Mr. Trump could just waltz into the White House with essentially no conventional qualifications. I think it's a really powerful point. It's not something that you can, you know, kind of empirically sort of, it's hard to kind of adjudicate or sort of evaluate as one does other arguments, but he's got his, you know, he's got his fingers on something incredibly important, but very, very hard to pin down.
All right, that's helpful. Wait, just as a clarification, would you say then when you added that Trump also clicked the box on traditional Republican issues such as having tax cuts, getting rid of regulation, appointing the right kind of judges in the minds of Republicans, that in those kinds of interests, he was not necessarily racist? Is that where that argument goes, or? Yes,
well, I would put it that's not a kind of necessary part of some degree of his support. Another way to put this is that I think a lot of times people miss, for understandable reasons, because he seems so and is so sort of proudly unlike other politicians. Mr. Trump can be very normal kind of vote for a considerable number of people. So business owners, well-off retirees, Mr. Trump is a fairly normal vote, and I think that it's not a very easy thing to perhaps understand, because the noise coming from the White House has been so, you know, very much like a kind of shock jock type for the last 4 years. But there's a great deal of normalcy for certain kinds of voters they're very comfortable with Mr. Trump. That is a common thing. Those are not the people who are going to be turning up to overturn this election, but they voted for him, and they will again. They would again.
So one quick point, still on the 2016 election, the part that Coates doesn't look to at all is the question of Hillary Clinton, the opponent. So she was, you know, much vilified as a politician in the country, and she was also a woman. To what extent should we consider the question of sexism as well as racism, or perhaps just the degree of hatred for any Clinton?
Yes, there was no question that, for example, in 2016, actually, strangely, both candidates were rather historically disliked by something just over 50% of the population, which is quite remarkable when one considers it, and probably says something about the nature of the American electoral process in general. But in terms of Hillary Clinton and why she lost, even though she did win over about 3 million more votes than Mr. Trump, I think there's absolutely a way where the perceptions of her and the ways that she's perceived of as a woman played a role in this. I also note that white women, like other white demographic groups, voted for Mr. Trump over Senator Clinton. So sexism or a assumption, either angry and even kind of violent, or rather more quiet and subtle, but an assumption that men simply belong in positions of power, influences women as well as men. And I think Hillary Clinton was certainly disadvantaged by that.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. So I want to turn now to 2020 and ask you similar kind of questions. I mean, obviously, we don't have the full empirical evaluation of the vote, but I want to get your basic sense of it. Do you think the politics of race contributed to this close election? I mean, Trump didn't win, but he came close, closer than a lot of us thought based on polls and other things. Do you think that instead of that, it was Trump's reputation as a strong hand on the economy or the polarization of the country that was more important than the politics of race? How would you?
I think the politics of race is absolutely inseparable from Mr. Trump. And, even prior to the birther movement, he really actually began his political profile in the 1980s in the aftermath of a terrible sexual assault in Manhattan, in Central Park, which was erroneously blamed on 5 young men of color, 4 Black and 1 Latino young men. They were later exonerated. And he took out a full-page ads sounding very much like Andrew Jackson, that the people must be avenged. So, race is inseparable from Mr. Trump's, career. But here, what I think you see in 2020 with his very strong showing is all the ways he became normal, all the ways he delivered on what he said he would do, all the ways he delivered for his evangelical base, which is to say he appointed a huge number of extremely conservative, even right-wing, I would say, judges, that Mike Pence, who's a crucial part of the Trump coalition as sort of the other side of his ideas about evangelical supremacy in the United States, he delivered for them. He delivered for many of the kind of, again, I'll say sort of conventional Republicans in the massive tax cut and deregulations. So Trump became normal, even more than he had been for a lot of people. Much was made of his small inroads that he made among Black men, for example, and in some parts among Latino communities. I frankly think that's a bit, overblown. The data indicates still overwhelmingly a white electorate for Mr. Trump. I find the exceptions to be just that. For example, Miami-Dade County, that alone very nearly, kind of won the state of Florida for Mr. Trump. Biden did better than Clinton did elsewhere in the state. That's a very particular community. Probably it has a lot to do also with the cruise ship industry, major employer in the area, which Mr. Trump loudly backed, as well as the large number of Cuban Americans there. All of which to say, I find the support for Trump, for Mr. Trump, over the last, let's say, 6 years, quite stable. White, evangelical, traditional Republican, plus the new politics or the more vehement politics of racial resentment, reaching all the way to avowed white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and skinheads.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you so much. I'm looking at the time, and I think I need to move on to you, Brian.
Okay. I just would like to explore with you Andrew Jackson, about whom you've written quite a bit, and the whole question of nativist politics. You'll recall that Donald Trump insisted on a painting of Andrew Jackson being hung in the Oval Office after his inauguration. And Jackson is known as one of the most racist presidents, having come to prominence by running, as you put it a few seconds ago, a politics of vengeance against Native Americans and other peoples of color. Well, how would you explain how Jackson has had such a hold on Trump's imagination? And does Andrew Jackson also have such a hold on a significant part of the Republican Party? And to what extent is the politics of vengeance, as Jackson cultivated, still alive and well in the American body public and especially in the Republican Party? Can you help us better understand that, please?
Sure. The irony here is that Andrew Jackson was a Democrat. He was, he basically sort of took what had been the Jeffersonian Party and turned it into the Democratic Party, as he called it. But yes, in recent years and in recent generations, he's become more of a hero on the right, as historians, scholars, political scientists, and then much of the general public has come to see Jackson's main project while he was in office, the deportation of roughly 70,000 indigenous peoples from the Southwest to open more cotton country for slave labor, which that was his main project and main, to his mind, accomplishment. So what does it have to do with vengeance? How can you be the ones being avenged if you're the ones deporting people? And there, I think it really is important to note that the United States was founded in profound grievance with the British Empire. It sounds obvious, but it's not. I mean, the Declaration of Independence, which we now read for the paragraphs that sound nice about and are stirring about self-evident rights, that's not how it was read at first. The main part of that is this series of accusations against the King of England. And the last of the accusations against the King of England, which in 18th century legal terms is the most powerful argument, is that he has, and I'll just paraphrase, that the king had essentially loosed, in his words, the merciless Indian savages against our people, and excited domestic insurrection, which is slave rebellion. In other words, the idea was that the British Empire had waged war against American households, against white American households. And that idea that the British Empire used indigenous and Black allies to kill white people in their homes was enormously powerful. It was 50 years of that ringing in Americans' ears. And the idea of the American people, the American nation, as being not just exclusively white, but extremely vulnerable, and their bodies always sort of vulnerable to the most extreme kinds of violence, has an enormous resonance in the United States. And it remains in all kinds of ways. There are so many movies, novels, action figures that are basically about the person taking the law into their own hands, using his own weapons to kill evildoers. And
John Wayne.
John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, there are so many, and they all basically say the same thing. A decent person's family was destroyed. A decent person was ruined by a corrupt, decadent society, and he can't take it anymore and takes the law into his own hands. That phrase actually has an English legal origin, but in contemporary America, it means having a weapon, having guns. And so the language of vengeance, to be avenged means you don't respect the law anymore. And to not respect the law anymore means that you're the sovereign. And that's an enormously powerful, I'll say seductive, intoxicating vision. And Mr. Trump is expert at tapping into it. So when he talks about the Central Park Five, when he talks about this terrible, attack on this woman, it resonates something fierce, as they say. It rears something very, very powerful in the American national concept and in our collective psyche.
Wow, that's helpful. I'm thinking about having seen recently a film called Shenandoah, which really highlights the points that you're making, and indeed taking up arms in many ways to, I'll say, protect our suburbs.
Yes.
And indeed, this kind of sexist language, protect the women, the white women in our suburbs. I see what you're getting at there. Would you help us better understand whether Donald Trump is really an aberration in American politics, or is he really part of a tradition of racialized politics? In fact, you seem to be have explained that, but we in Canada need to understand, I think, a little bit more about this tradition of racialized politics, and in fact, a link with what might be called populism, nativism, populism. Could you help us unpack that a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, I really think that although Donald Trump embodies a lot of very, very old themes in American history, I really think that he is unprecedented as a president because he does not pretend to do the role of president. And every other president did. Even those presidents who really were just playing along, it really matters if the public figure pretends to play a role or not. Whether their heart's into it is another matter. Donald Trump makes very clear he doesn't do that. So that really is different. I really think he is, I won't say an aberration, but something very original.
Wow.
In terms of populism, though, I think it's what's interesting here is that for all we're saying about the United States and all I'm talking about with Jackson, the United States also, of course, has a very, very old, very, very rich tradition of being a country of a nation of laws, of a very, very old and effective constitutional form of government, of deep democratic traditions that usually restrain or often combat violent impulses in society, including white majoritarian impulses in society. What is unusual here is that the emergence of that at the highest level of government. So previously, you find a lot of governors, one finds a fair number of state representatives who will speak the language of bloody vengeance, who will speak the language of out and out white supremacy. They typically don't get further from there, or if they do, they learn so well to speak in dog whistles and to speak politely and to, again, play a role that's something quite different than Donald Trump. So the populist tradition is very strong in the United States because there's a majoritarian impatience with the rule of law and a majoritarian impatience with the fact of a multiracial society.
Thank you very much, Jason. Carol.
Yes, thank you for that. So I was thinking as you were talking about that I want to move on to talk about polarization and U.S. institutions. But even in the time of Jackson, there was quite a bit of polarization, wasn't there? You know, I'm thinking of John Quincy Adams, who stood up for the rule of law. He fought, after being president, he became a member of the House of Representatives in order to fight slavery. That there was these two things fighting one against the other, even then. So, if there's one thing that's clear, as you said at the top, it's that we are a polarized country, the United States. And I'm wondering to what extent our institutions feed that polarization. And in particular, I want to talk about the Electoral College, because it's the most peculiar of American institutions. And so I'd like to start by talking about the Electoral College as it played out in this election. And then I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about the history of the Electoral College. So I thought we'd start, though, with a little bit of a thought experiment, which is how different would the election have felt, and I really mean felt, had it been decided by the popular vote?
I think it would have felt a lot better. I think I really don't have much nice to say about the Electoral College, and I'll put it like this: the fact that the United States has a real hard time having a coherent national public is because there is no national public, because the president of the United States is not selected by the national public, but rather by first past the post systems within the various states. And that is, it's terrible for an American national concept. Yeah. Just to take it back a little bit to our previous discussion about race, and it's easy to overlook it. So it's easy to overlook in a Canadian context or a European context that the United States has by far, historically, had by far a much larger non-white population than other Western states did until relatively recently in history. And that's a really important point to not overlook. And when one considers that alone makes a national concept very hard. It would have anyway, had there not been even a second takeoff of slavery in the early 19th century, which it appears the founders did not see coming. Even without that, it would have been very, very hard to have a coherent national concept. But it's well nigh impossible to have one when the one person who's supposed to embody or speak for the entire nation is selected in this way. So I think it's terrible for the United States. I use the word, do our institutions drive this polarization? I guess I think of it more as our venerable institutions, which are impressive because they're so old, are also problematic because they're so old. At one level, it's very impressive to have 231 years of unbroken constitutional governance, but that's 231 years of unbroken constitutional government with relatively little updating. And other democracies, Canada included, as recently as the 1980s, have redone or introduced constitutions or charters, or they have had real sort of best practices updating of their institutions and of their democratic institutions. The United States hasn't. And the Electoral College is therefore the most outrageous or the most sort of outlandish tip of the iceberg, which is a quite sclerotic institutional framework for a country that's always struggled to have a coherent national concept.
Wow, that's really helpful. So it makes me wonder, just to push the question a little bit, would you say that the Electoral College, has allowed us to hobble together sort of a fake view that we have a national unity when we don't, and that if we had gone to something like a popular vote, that there might have been more danger that these institutions might not have lasted, that sort of things that were hidden over and bandaged over would have been exposed?
No, that's a great way to put it. That's really interesting. I hadn't been thinking it in that way. I had been thinking of it in all the ways that the Electoral College, I think of it as a kind of the right metaphor. I think of it as sort of a cage, I suppose, that sort of prevents that sort of prevents a good national concept from growing. But another way to put it is that it probably also papered over some of the things that would have prevented a national concept from the very outset. But it's really quite a remarkable thing in the sense that it makes it so that there are so many people in the United States who simply do not matter when it comes to selecting a president, and who feel that it makes it so that there can be this really narrow rush for basically about 6 states to kind of determine what the nation will look like. It's just I can't find excuses for it anymore. There were arguments for it in the past. I'm happy to talk about it. I think the
That's where I'd like to go next.
But it's just not excusable anymore.
Yeah. So let's do that though, for the sake of sort of getting the arguments out on the table. Like, how did we come to have this institution? Because it was not inevitable.
Right.
Yeah.
No. And here I'll put the hat on of sort of trying to really approach the framers, the 55 odd people who devised the U.S. Constitution in 1787. Those people, should be admired as being brilliant political architects. They were really into architectural metaphors, and they're brilliant architects.
Yeah.
And they basically, the way I look at it is it was a bridge too far to imagine, because they were already creating a more coherent national government in a country where most people thought of their country as their state. Yeah. So Thomas Jefferson said, "Virginia is my country." People in New England called New England a nation. So making a really, one president for the entire nation with a whole national vote was just a bridge too far. And I think they really didn't even go there that much. It was more the assumption that they would have to have the states or the Electoral College, as they figured it out, filter what they took to be the relatively easy choice to be president. And I'll just say the exceptions here prove the rule. The gentleman at the convention who said, "Why don't we just have a popular vote for president?" was from Scotland. James Wilson. He had no state loyalties. Or Alexander Hamilton, current Broadway star and runner-up in the Burr Hamilton was a nationalist because he was from the West Indies. He had no state loyalties, but those were outliers. Most of the framers were deeply connected to their state or to their country. And so the Electoral College was a way to reassure them or just express that they're putting a more national government together, but the states are still going to be the determining players in the political game.
So I'm going to push back on that just a little bit. Often, we hear well, we hear a lot of things about we hear that the reason why we have an electoral college is because the founders were afraid of demagogues, right? That they feared the popular vote, right? We hear that that they feared for small states, that they thought small states would be left behind if we went there. But there is a sense, though, that a lot of these people are coming together to make a better union, because the Articles of Confederation had been a disaster and the states on their own couldn't be trusted. And in fact, wasn't there some distrust even of state governments? You know, Patrick Henry was a wild and unleashed thing. So I'm wondering, you know, is there something else that's going on in the Electoral College? You know, they didn't set out to have an Electoral College. They had no way through it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're really sort of, I think, you know, improvising when it came to these Article 2. So Article 1, Congress is supposed to be congressional-based government. The president, it's a new thing. There had been this big backlash against governors, royal governors, of course. So they were cautious about that. The way I look at it, though, is that it's more that there were general fear of majoritarian rule. That's northern as well as southern. There's plenty of northern federalists who were especially freaked out about the idea that most people wanted debt relief, which they did, and they wanted to insulate the government from that. And that's a very powerful thing that the Federalists had. The other dimension of this, though, is slavery. So it is just a fact that we have now the notes from James Madison during the brief debate about the Electoral College. You know, again, it wasn't it didn't get to be this enormous debate because it just was a bridge too far. But Madison clearly said, you know, the southern states would never go for a just singular popularly elected government because of the slavery issue. And what they mean of that, of course, is that a slave owner was profoundly opposed to majoritarian rule, because in many parts of Virginia and in all of South Carolina, the majority of people were enslaved. The idea of majority rule is simply impossible for them. And so, you know, that is a component of the design of the Electoral College. I don't think it's accurate to say the Electoral College was designed to shield slave owners. And it's not the right way to look at it. It's more, there's a general fear of state level majorities. The Electoral College is one expression of that. And one reason for it is because Southern Federalists were afraid of majorities, because of course they're afraid of majorities. And they were afraid of majorities as well, of being in a national government where there might very well soon be a majority of people who were not only non-slave holders, but increasingly disgusted by slavery, which in 1787 is absolutely one trajectory. One can find that, you know, if we think now about where history is going, although I'm skeptical about that idea, you could imagine in 1787, slavery is going away. Slavery is on the decline. And I think a lot of the founding generation really wanted to believe that, in a kind of confirmation bias, because it was easier to believe than to confront it.
Yeah. So do you think, you know, one of the other articles we read for today was Alexander Kaysar's piece from the New York Times, and he makes the argument quite boldly, and I believe you pushed against this just a couple of minutes ago, that the reason for the Electoral College is for the power of the slave states. Because of the 3/5 clause, they got extra representation, even though they didn't have those people who were going to be voting. And then similarly, once slavery was over and the enslaved people were free, then there was a 5/5 clause in a sense, because the Jim Crow laws kept them from voting. So once again, it was more power for the southern states and so forth. And he even goes on to argue that in 1970, when we came close to having an amendment that would get rid of the Electoral College, that was held up by two Southerners, segregationist Southerners. Do you find that just going too far, though, in the argument, sort of?
I think it's accurate in the 20th century post-1965 turn from the Democratic Party away from the party of Southern white supremacy. I just think that in the founding moment type thing, there are many factors that made anti-majoritarian ideas and filters that's all baked into the Constitution. And it wasn't just the Southerners who were opposed or afraid of majority rule. But there's no question about it that by the time, again, it's really an important thing in American history to look at how slavery exploded, took off again around 1800 and really during the 1820s and 30s.
Yeah.
That second birth of slavery, the slave owners really took over and really benefited from the Electoral College, really benefited from the power of the courts and the Senate, and ensconced themselves in the institutions of the Constitution in a way that does not speak well of the Constitution.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. That's really helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Brent.
Yeah. I would like to ask you a couple questions about how the United States can heal in the aftermath of the Donald Trump presidency, related to perhaps some of the early questions that were posed before. How have the different institutions of the American Republic, including government agencies, the FBI, intelligence services, the military, the Department of Justice, and the judiciary, been impacted by the Trump administration? And is there a need to restore their credibility at this time?
I think that a lot of the institutions of the federal state, and maybe we should say more of the executive branch. So the executive branch has grown enormously in power since the Second World War, and it's a huge bureaucracy unto itself. And I think that the institutions around the executive branch are the ones that have been most affected by Mr. Trump's, avowed. It's not like he's faking or hiding this, avowed attack on the administrative state. So I think they are the ones who are most sort of in need of kind of reasserting themselves. I will just say a quick word about the military. In this case, I'm biased. I'm son and grandson of Army captains and grew up as an Army brat, as we say in the United States. The officer corps of the United States Army and other armed services they're highly professional, and that means in one level they're not to be assumed that they'll be sort of pushovers. I've discussed this a lot with colleagues of mine who work in Latin America or who work in the Middle East, and have often asked me, what would the military do in the event that there is a disputed election? And there, I think that there is I have much more confidence that the military is highly professional, and they take their role very seriously. So I think that they are not the ones who will need some rebuilding. I think the rebuilding would have to be done by the institutions that answer to the president. They are going to be hard pressed to recover their legitimacy, to recover the sense that they are civic servants, and that they are doing a role for the American people, as opposed to, frankly, in some cases, acting like part of a regime rather than an administration.
Let's look at the DOJ as an example, okay, under William Barr. And perhaps let's take a concrete example of that. Joe Biden has indicated some hesitation about being involved or indeed promoting legal proceedings against Donald Trump and his associates. Do you think that, indeed the DOJ rather, engaging in legal proceedings against Trump and his associates, would that become a major obstacle to healing what has become a deeply divided nation?
I think it would. I would rather see, if there are, criminal investigations to occur against Donald J. Trump, for example, in terms of tax evasion or violation of election laws from 2016, it would be better if that were handled by federal judiciaries or federal courts, most notably in Manhattan, 2nd District of the state of New York, rather than the Department of Justice. In a larger sense, I just want to say that Americans very rarely give this credit or don't want to think about this, but one of the really pre-American revolutionary origins of democracy or constitutional government in the Western tradition and I'm only speaking about that because I'm entirely ignorant of other traditions, is the independence of courts.
Yes.
And so one will see this in the writings of Montesquieu, of 18th century philosophers who say the reason that Europe has certain forms of liberty, not democracy, right, but is because the independence of its courts. And that is absolutely foundational to a civil society. And if the courts are unable to do their role, perform their role, I'm afraid all is lost. And here I'll say one of the best quotes from one of the founders, James Madison. He's talking about how in response to people like Patrick Henry, who were constantly attacking any kind of centralized government for explicitly racist and reasons of slavery. Madison kept saying, well, we're going to divide this institution against the other, and there'll be a check and a balance here, and there'll be an institutional motive here. But then he just sort of stops and says, we must put our faith somewhere. Someone has to do their job. Someone has to play their role. Someone has to take it upon themselves to act as if they are a member of an institution, and that is bigger than they are. It's bigger than their party or bigger than their political well-being. We have to put our faith somewhere, and that's right. And I think in the case of the courts, not just there, but other places, we have to put our faith that people will do their job and people will perform a role rather than pursue naked self-interest or shameless power grabbing.
An illustration of that, perhaps, was when the new Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, was sworn in. Contrary to previous practice, Donald Trump insisted on being there and being visibly there while she was sworn in, whereas I believe past practice was that the president, as representing the executive branch, was noticeably absent from that. So precisely to give a message regarding the separation of powers, the judiciary from the executive. It seems to me that a lot of people not only pointing that particular illustration, but saw that in many ways as an encroachment of the executive on the separation of powers, most notably regarding the judiciary. Is that your perception as well?
It is, and I would say as well that the Supreme Court, it's really quite a thing to note this. There have only been a few times where the Supreme Court was so implicated in national policy as opposed to being the highest court in the land to have appellate and original jurisdiction over cases. I mean, it's really not supposed to be about striking down legislation. It's only done very rarely in the early republic. It's usually done at the federal courts would strike down state laws, usually about debtor relief. That was the main thing. Striking down Congress's laws extremely rare, and only the second time it was done caused the Civil War. The decision by Chief Justice Taney in the Dred Scott case. Taney was a appointee of Andrew Jackson. That made the Civil War inevitable by essentially saying that there can be no legislative interference into slavery or limit on slavery. So it's really bad news when the Supreme Court is so implicated in national policy as opposed to doing what it's supposed to do, which is to be the highest court in the land for cases that come before it as original or appellate jurisdiction.
Okay, thank you. Carol.
Yes. So I wanted to turn to our two parties and talk a little bit about them. So first of all, let's talk about the GOP, which should be gracefully accepting the change in power and making way for the new administration, and they're not, of course, doing that at all. And perhaps what's most surprising is not that President Trump is doing this, but that he is fully backed by the Republicans, with a few exceptions. I guess Lamar Alexander said something, and a couple others. Is this a sign that that this party has fundamentally changed and is now almost a quasi-authoritarian party, not just a populist party, but almost a quasi-authoritarian party, and they will lead wherever Trump will make them follow? or they will fall wherever.
I think there's considerable evidence for that. I have a colleague in the law school at McGill who says, look, I'm just going by the sort of empirical information. The Republican Party in the United States seems to have more in common with far-right parties in, say, Eastern Europe than with conservative parties in most Western democracies, Canada included. And he's very adamant about that and says, the idea of both sidisms is wrong. What we're seeing here in political scientific terms is, there's one side, a unilateral or only one pole or unipolar radicalization, whereas the other pole is much more diffuse. Although now I think the other pole is actually much more organized precisely because of Mr. Trump. But as for the Republican Party overall, I guess I would just say that the Republican Party as a institution is far weaker than it was, for example, in the time of Richard Nixon. The party itself said, really, this is not good for us, so you need to go. And Nixon, to his credit, did. The party itself is very weak now. It seems to be actually more like a vessel that is driven one way or the other, rather than a powerful institution in its own right, with its own self-interest and its own traditions and its own protocols. On the Democratic side, it's really up in the air. There are profound divisions among the Democrats, seem mostly to be amicable now because of the unifying force of Mr. Trump. But one story in American politics that we don't talk about much, understandably, is the rise of a new left. I mean, the left is resurgent in the United States. And by the left, I mean not neoliberal or centrist Democrats like Mr. Biden or either Clinton or Obama in many ways. Although Mr. Obama was kind of different in his own right. I'm talking about left
progressives,
democratic socialism, and really confronting capitalism type forces are resurgent in the United States. So I think both parties are struggling. And it's ironic, right? So you have this bitter partisanship, extreme partisanship, and weak parties.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, that's it's very poignant the way you put it there. Yeah, I was struck just last week by the infighting in the Democratic Party. Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, the moderate, it really being quite honest in her anger with the progressives, with Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez and others, saying, because you guys were talking about defund the police, we almost lost this election, and it makes you wonder if the Democratic Party is kind of in an impossible situation. They owe to their constituency putting through legislation that starts to repair some of the injustices of racial politics, and yet they won't get elected if they do so, or they have that impression, at least, that they won't.
They have that impression. I think that the Democrats have a severe confidence problem going back quite a ways. But I actually think both parties really, as institutions, are much weaker now. And just to sort of, if I could just sort of say something else about partisanship as distinct from parties.
Please.
That is the thing that really is worrying me the most. And it's really, what one wonders, how can one prevent this, or how can one pull back from this abyss? And to me, first of all, it's a lot easier to prevent it than to pull back from the abyss. And once you're in it, I keep telling my students, one way to approach this is the United States is going through a very difficult time right now. And that sounds very obvious, but just say it like that. And that's maybe a better way to approach it. And when we're looking at this, I tend to think more in terms of what institutional changes can you make to diffuse or dilute extreme partisan hatred, rather than like saving your soul type thing or having people change their heart. And one very important way that Canadians have been better at, and maybe should think more about, is having multiple parties, which means you also have to have alliances, or even things like proportional voting, gives you an interest in not demonizing other people, because you might need them as a kingmaker. That is interesting. So you're appealing to their political self-interest rather than the better angels of their nature. But it can manifest in the better angels of one's nature if you have a political system that can do that. I think that is very possible, and many democracies, including Canada's, that I think are more agile and updated and able to confront their problems, not necessarily overcome them, but to confront them. I think that can be done. But for my own country, I'm really worried. I don't see a way out right now. The only way out, there has to be a decisive victory by one side. The other side then pulls back and regroups. That seems unlikely. It's possible, but unlikely. Yeah. There could be some rapprochement, which seems incredibly unlikely.
Yeah.
Or there could be darker things, which I frankly don't want to think about. But I would be lying if I didn't say that I have, because there's such paralysis in the body politic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps you were alluding to the situation in Canada, and I'd just like to explore with you what are the implications of this election for Canada. And there's three areas that I was thinking I'd like to explore with you. First of all, regarding environmental policy, trade, and possibly defense. Now, I'm conscious that we have a lot of people that have questions to pose you, and so I'll look at just perhaps the first two. Now, regarding environmental policy, President-elect Joe Biden has indicated that he will sign an executive order to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord, which is good news for countries like Canada, who have supported this accord, at least in word. Joe Biden has promised to invest massively in clean energy. He's also said that he'd cancel the permit that Donald Trump has given for the Keystone XL pipeline from Canada. How do you think that this will be received by Canada's federal government and by a province like Alberta, who is so much counting on the Keystone XL pipeline?
I think that in general, the Canadian federal state will welcome Mr. Biden just at the level of predictability and kind of general overall sort of border to border basic things like border crossing, which of course is very complicated in a pandemic situation. But I do want to say something about Alberta and Pennsylvania, two areas that will hurt to move away from oil. It will hurt them.
Yeah.
I think a wise political or an agile political system would say, we are going to therefore concentrate in these areas to create and simply sort of use the power of the state to employ you and to enable you to build what we need to build, which is tens of thousands of high-tech windmills and a huge range of other environmental infrastructure. It can be a choice. It doesn't have to be a kind of fate for an Alberta or a Pennsylvania. And I think that it would be really refreshing to have an honest sort of discussion about this and not pretend that there are no winners and losers in environmental policy. Be candid and honest with people, but also say, because we have a coherent national concept, we're not going to just throw you under the bus. We're not just going to leave you behind. That's why I think that good democracies act, and they talk about how they act, but they act first.
Got it. Regarding trade, over 75% of Canada's exports go to the US, but trade relations under the Trump presidency have not gone very smoothly. President-elect Biden has said that he dropped some of Trump's most aggressive moves against the allies, like the steel and aluminum tariffs, supposedly based on national security grounds. He's also hinted that that's President-elect Biden, might try renegotiating U.S. re-entry into the Pan-Pacific Trade Pact, now known as the CPTPP. But Joe Biden has also promised more Buy American policies. And of course, the perennial disputes like softwood lumber are not likely to disappear. Is the election of Joe Biden as US president good news for Canada's trade balance with its largest partner? What do you think of that?
I think it is. Because absolutely Biden will pursue and needs to pursue certain policies to encourage manufacturing and purchase power in the United States. But he's not going to do it in a retaliatory way against Canada. What he will do is he'll have his trade partners and his negotiators tell Mr. Trudeau or his successor, here's what we're going to do. And so you might want to think about readjusting this way and that way. I am confident that in this case, I'm an optimist. I'm confident that in those ways, Canada and the United States can work those things out fairly easily, frankly, because they'll simply communicate as they normally have. and be able to pivot here and there, with the big exception really being the oil producing areas of the United States and Canada. That is going to be the major political test of how robust and how honest our political cultures are.
Got it. Both Carol and I have many other questions, but I think we have to hold off at this point because according to Jonathan, there's quite a few excellent questions that have been prepared from the people that are participating in this webinar. Thank you, Jason. Great.
Sure.
Thank you.
Jonathan.
To speak just for a second on behalf of the audience, thank you for this incredibly rich discussion. Really appreciate it. Very stimulating. So I am going to begin with a question that refers to the Coates article once again, the first white president. In the article, Coates speaks of whiteness and blackness as well-articulated identities within a US cultural context. Can you expand a little bit on the history of those identities?
Sure. Yes, I was actually just working on something just now about the time in the English Empire. This is going back a ways, of course, when the word Christian was replaced with the word white. So what you have normally actually early in the colonization is the description of European, British, Scottish, English, whatever, as Christians, as distinct from native peoples or Africans. And there's a great deal of complexity about sort of, in what cases enslavement is justified or lawful, but you don't see until the 1670s or 80s the emergence of the word white. And the reason is quite simple. Quakers were trying to convert enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples to Christianity. And the slave owners worried that that would then mean they could not enslave them. Because in both Christian, as in Islamic and Jewish traditions, and the Abrahamic traditions, the enslavement of one's own brothers in a household of faith is, sinful or seriously problematic. So you have the emergence of the word white to categorize that race. To take the story a bit further, 100 years later, 150 years later, white people, that idea comes back in an American context in the way I was describing earlier, as the people who are been given this land or are destined for this land and whose bodies are constantly in peril because of the empire and because of their non-white enemies. So white is a powerful construct of not just innocence, but injured innocence that can quickly turn into a quite angry demand for sovereignty and power. And black as a other category for this, or as a foil to this, has a very long history that has everything to do with that categorization relating to slavery. And it's a long story, but I think that maybe the better way to address it is to look at the emergence of white, which Coates is very interested in, as a imaginary. People who believe themselves to be white, he always writes. And what he sees in Mr. Trump is someone who carries that much more openly and much more, one might say shamelessly, or much more, in a much more aggrieved way than any of the previous presidents.
Thank you. That was really illuminating. So to dovetail with that, sort of spinning off of it, another question that we've seen in the Q&A. I'm going to generalize it a little bit to give you a little more room, but could you comment on the significance of the connection between, let's say, racial-based issues and gender-based issues in the 2020 election? Certainly we see this in the figure of Trump himself, that those two things are conflated, often confused. So could you say a little bit more about how these kind of racial categories interact with gender categories?
That's a great question. I think that they interact in the sense that the image of a white man as the sort of paragon of a person who's supposed to be in charge was very much sort of forefronted and is embodied with Mr. Trump. But as I say, I think that it's wrong to think of that appeal or that image as being exclusively one that appeals to white men or to men in general. It can also sort of play into or be embraced or defended in some ways by women. I think, though, the other part of this is that Mr. Trump did lose support just generally speaking among women. One stunning poll I saw, we saw that the polls were a bit off, but not this off. It's found that right before the election, if you just took all men, regardless of race, class, it was about even. If you just all women, Biden was leading by 21 points. Wow. And he definitely won over and won a large number of women who were put off by, I'll put it that way, Mr. Trump's, I'll say, aggressive masculinity. And one can see this very obviously in some of the last times of the election when Mr. Trump made very, let's say, transactional appeals to suburban women, saying, why don't you love me? If you don't like me anymore, I save your neighborhoods. He lost a lot of them, and that certainly cost him in blue counties. They were more blue because more women voted there.
Thank you for that. One last question on the kind of the similar theme. We touched on it earlier in the conversation. The Black and Latino voters who did vote for Trump. Now, we say it's a small minority. I heard what you said about it being sort of quite steady, but what history can we look to understand why people of color would choose a president who is, sort of shows these, sort of quite racist sort of sides to himself, not infrequently?
Yeah, I think one way to put it, I think of it also is that because the idea of the American public has so collapsed in the last 40 or 50 years, that people have such a low expectation about what the public will do for them. And in a world in which there is no public and everything is private and there's no one to look after you or to, no one seems to care, one very reasonable, rational response is to hold on to whatever you've got. And if it turns out that you are a person, just for example, of Latino background, but you have citizenship, are you necessarily going to be, should we expect them to always have solidarity with other people who we identify as Latino? Well, maybe that's asking quite a lot of them. They might have a very understandable desire to be more secure in their citizenship, and therefore could possibly vote for Mr. Trump. I also think there's also a real, specific things. I'm very interested in the power of employers in the United States as being more than in the Canadian context. And employers decide what common sense is in a lot of places in the United States. And when you have employers that are very powerful, like the cruise industry in Miami-Dade County, who decided that Trump had their back and Biden would not, that matters a lot. And so I think there are these more particular stories embedded within a larger world in which your best play in much of the United States is to hold on to what you've got. And if that's citizenship, if that's a negative COVID test, if that's, hold on to whatever you have. And Donald Trump might be the guy to be your champion in that respect.
Speaking of a climate of fear, it seems. Yeah. So to turn, we spoke a little bit about Canada, but to get down to brass tacks perhaps a little bit more, what checks do you see in Canada that might prevent a leader like Trump? And I'm not going to tell you what that means. The questioner didn't sort of suggest, but like a leader as divisive as Trump, a leader with the positions that Trump holds, but just a leader like Trump, whatever that might mean from assuming power here.
It's an excellent question. I'll give just one idea. There are many others. I think the Canadian national concepts, plural, make it less likely to have someone like Mr. Trump, whose appeal is based on, I will restore the infinite might and power of a certain kind of American nation, a kind of godlike power to destroy and smoke. I don't think that's a dominant discourse in Canada. You find it in certain circles, but I don't think it's a dominant discourse, because the national concept in Canada, which I admittedly understand less, certainly, but there are many more traditions of it being within society rather than against society, of it being built upon political compromise is a bad word, political coalition, national coalitions, English and French, traditionally, but I think others now too. I think it is a more agile national concept. I think that is a considerable barrier for someone like Mr. Trump. And maybe just a final point, I do think that the parliamentary system, for all its problems, I think it's overall better, because the thing is, when there's a parliamentary system and when there's a strong mandate from the government governs. And that is very hard in the United States, both because of its deeply divided society and because the quite deliberate obfuscation of national social policy by the federal structure.
Thank you. Okay, so we've talked a little bit. You called the Electoral College the tip of the iceberg, as far as so I want to pull up a concept that was in the Q&A file, which is gerrymandering, which, let's face it, has become a political institution if it wasn't before. So could you speak a little bit to the history of that and how you would, I guess, how you would situate it vis-a-vis the 2020 election?
Sure. So it's definitely very old. It comes from Elbridge Gerry, who is a Massachusetts anti-federalist who wanted to make sure his part of Massachusetts was able to be shielded from the Federalist of the insufferable Federalist of Boston. And so it has a long history of you subject your voting district and put in all kinds of contortions to capture people who are more sympathetic to your votes. But it has come to be much worse in the last 40 years. And frankly, largely, I'm trying to find another way to put this, but it's largely about race. The gerrymandering is largely to find ways to make a voting district mostly white, which involves ridiculous, next level geometry type forms of a district. And it plays a huge role in the way American power works. It's not so much institution. I'll say that, the other things about American constitutional structure that is sclerotic and old and not very good are basic things like the way that the way that votes are counted and the lack of administration for that. The United States does not have an elections Canada. It does not have a federal oversight, as almost all Western democracies do. There are, at last count, 10,500 jurisdictions in the United States that count or canvass votes. And you could say, well, it shows the vibrancy and grassroots history of American democracy. Yeah, and it also makes the US very vulnerable to all manner of shenanigans and all manner of ways to overrule what should simply be the majority's decisions.
Okay, so let's turn from gerrymandering, which is sort of at the political and institutional level, to a problem that perhaps is equally pernicious, which is money. So money has become, it's always been institutionalized in certain forms, but most recently the PAC.
Yes.
So would you speak a little bit to the role, and this is, if I understand correctly, this has been by far the most expensive election ever in the history, probably the history of the world. But can you speak to the role of money in the 2020 election? I'll just give you sort of a long rope here.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I would say, I guess the best way to begin this is to say that just to go back to the parties being weaker. They're weaker because PACs, political action committees, think tanks, other extremely well-funded sort of outside groups now funnel their demands through the party rather than the party deciding for itself. And this is the last 40, 50 years, I would say this has become really, really dramatic. So one part of this is the parties weakening and them being replaced by or sort of like dominated by or valued back here and there by extremely high money concentrated capital in political action committees. The other side of this is juridical, and the Supreme Court decisions over the last 10 years to essentially roll back, most famously Citizens United decision in 2011, is to essentially make it that money is speech, and therefore if you have more money, you have more speech, and you can give however much money you want to bankroll a election or a politician. In many cases, the PACs don't even have to disclose who is giving the money. This stands in contrast to especially in Quebec, actually, there was quite strict restrictions on how much you can contribute to a campaign, but in Canada in general, although the former Prime Minister Stephen Harper tried to undo that in an earlier court case, most Western democracies have decided you can't just let the money speak, because it speaks much louder than those who don't have it. And so some restriction on campaigns exists. It does not in the United States. And that makes the issues that we've been talking about much worse, because as you have, again, it's this irony, these incredibly superheated partisanship, yet weak parties, and strangely, the inability to have social policy of any kind, because so many special interests, which I should say like very wealthy people's interests, speaking far louder, deciding things much better. Sorry, final point, I'm babbling, but
no, it's all good. It's good.
I found very interesting that there was one could say, is the US government really so dysfunctional? Not if you're, not if you're an extremely wealthy individual, not if you have a particular sorts of interest in the United States or around the world. The US government is actually very efficient. And in the sense that it will make sure in any legislation that those interests are taken care of. And this honestly reminds me of nothing else better than 18th century Parliament in Great Britain, where you will have laws passed, and then in the margins of the laws will have, and here Lord Sheffield wants this particular law because Lord Sheffield has that ship in East London and wants that done. I mean, quite remarkable form of very wealthy people getting what they want in law. And that is what is happening and has happened for the last generation in the United States.
Wow, remarkable. So, one second here, I just need to refresh my read of this question. So you've characterized that change, that as a change. There are those, Chomsky comes to mind, Bill Moyers, who have said that the United States was set up from the beginning to be for the top, for the wealthiest 5%. In your read of history, is this a continuous thing? Is this sort of what we see in this past election, something it's a continuity, or is it a discontinuity? Is there a break with the tradition from before?
So I think with all respect to those authors, I have a slightly different view of American history in general. I see a number of periods in American history when there were pro-majority laws that were in fact put in place and passed. One has to understand, of course, that those majorities were in most cases exclusively white and often explicitly anti-Black. However, that does not mean that it was the same as the interests of the wealthiest 5% of people. I don't think that's the case. I mean, there's a couple of examples. Probably the most obvious, because it also captures the racial dimension of it, is land policy. The United States government was the most generous welfare state ever in its organization of Western land to be extremely cheap, and after the Civil War, literally free in the Homestead Act. This had enormous consequences for American society and greatly increased the overall prosperity of white people against the poorer white people against the demands of wealthier people. Another more obscure example, I tell my students in one class that we're going to be studying a lot about inheritance law, and many of them, of course, leave as soon as I say that, but it's actually really fascinating. And the United States bragged repeatedly and justly after the revolution that they had democratized, most states had democratized inheritance laws to make it so that that properties were distributed much more equally. This is critical in a context from a British system that locked the fortunes in one line, and Americans bragged about it endlessly. And British observers said, yeah, they're right. It actually makes a much more democratic world. So I see America as having really vibrant, although always profoundly flawed, democratic traditions. I see no reason why those traditions can't be made more real for our multiracial reality. No reason of a force of nature. The problem is rather and kind of moral, in the sense that the United States is unable at the present moment to act as a coherent nation.
Thank you again. So that vision that you're painting, where there's sort of there's no reason, as it were, but the politics of the situation constrain us. I'd like to do away with that distinction for just a moment and ask you to sort of imagine, maybe this is utopian, but to imagine into the future. Brian touched on this earlier, the possibility of healing the rift. And whether or not we think it's sort of practically probable, what future could you imagine that would be sort of, in a way, realistic or sort of true to the history as you know it, would be, you know, sort of continuous with the history, but would nevertheless result in a reconciliation perhaps a generation from now, where we would see the United States settle again into some kind of healthy democratic pattern? What would be required for that to happen?
It's a wonderful question, because it's also, you know, to me, it's not utopian, because you're asking, you know, something that's consistent in or conceivable within America's history, you know, as opposed to just, you know, willy-nilly type. So I have a very concrete suggestion, and it's just to throw out there. I suspect that the last year has shown us that we have a severely reduced capacity to care for the physical well-being of the nation, of the people, in moments of the pandemic. As we speak, in 2 states of the United States, the positivity rate for COVID is over 50%. And the deviation rates of hospitals that say you can't come to the hospital because we're literally full is growing at an alarming rate. And this is not unrelated to the fact that over 150 hospitals in rural areas closed in the United States over the last 5 years alone. So build hospitals, increase the capacity to care for the society. That would do a lot, I think. The very existence of hospitals as institutions where peoples are taken care of when their body is ailing or that of their loved one is ailing is, to me, essential to a moral civilization. So build hospitals in areas that are underserved by hospitals. Let those hospitals run as public institutions rather than as businesses that are also always cutting costs, because there's no money to be made in taking care of people. And if this were done, I think in a concrete way, I think it literally is healing. I think it's actually literally a quite actual sort of address or solve to the bleeding body politic. And I think done in that way, in a practical way, saying we're gonna not have our people die. We're not gonna have our people suffer when we can stop that, would be enormously helpful. I might also just say that it might be well worth other countries as well thinking about this, that maybe the capacity to care, which is to say, you know, it's not just the number of hospitals, it's the number of people who are medically literate, it's the number of people who are drawn in some ways into the institutions that help hospitals. That should be a sign of wealth, of national well-being, and if I forgive the antiquarian term, of national glory. I am not allergic, as many of my students are, to that kind of language. I think words like national honor and glory can be used to good ends. People seek glory and honor. That's why they do all manner of things. It's one powerful drive, as you know, as a scholar of classics as well. So use it and say the nation's glory can be in its capacity to care for those who are sick. The nation's glory can be in its remarkable advances, which the United States is still doing in science and medicine. You know, talk about it in that way. I think that can be healing. I really do.
That's a remarkably original answer. I've never heard anything like that, and I think it's visionary, to be honest.
I should say, if I may, I won't take credit for it, because I was reading.
No, steal it, steal it.
I was reading, it's a really fascinating, one of the most interesting debates in Congress I've ever seen was about Andrew Jackson's conduct in Florida. And this no-name legislator from Northern Virginia said, you know, I keep hearing that it's a nation's glory, but shouldn't a nation's glory be, at that time he was saying, our ability to fight smallpox? They just established a National Smallpox Institute. Shouldn't it be our ability to have schools? Shouldn't it be our ability to have charities, schools and orphanages? Isn't that what glory of the nation should be? And this is a remarkable speech. And I see no reason not to say that is the case. And I know it's playing literally with fire, because the term for ambition used to be that it's a fire, but you know, it can be turned to good. It can be used to argue for the better angels of our nature.
you've used that term before in this particular conversation, and you used it in an interesting way. You suggested that other motivations could be married to it, less pristine ones, less altruistic ones, and that
Yes.
that could actually make the better, strengthen the better angels of our nature, as it were. So let me turn that beautiful vision that you had around and stand at the end of that. You know, in the year 2050, looking back to this history,
Yeah.
what has gone wrong that we've stopped caring? What is it that we've arrived at this point where it seems like that issue has no currency, and it really didn't seem to have a great deal of currency in the 2020 elections in the States?
Because because the United States, I'm talking the US here, because we don't see each other as equally American, because we do not have a unified, coherent national concept. Because of that, it is therefore possible or even inevitable to be not only indifferent to, but positively hostile to your fellow citizens and your fellow Americans. And, you know, this year again, many of my students won't believe me when I tell them that the US, which seems to be the most nationalistic culture ever, well, no, it has actually a very weak national concept because of the inability to see other people as your civic brothers and sisters. And I think that is the most difficult thing. And so, but to my mind, and to go to your question, I think the key though is to act first and establish institutions or practices that actually enact that, and then talk about it, and then you know, cover it in glory and describe it as such, rather than the other way around. Because there is no traction right now to appeal to. You might as well appeal to a law that doesn't exist, or a law of gravity that is not operative. One has to act and then describe what one has done to rebuild something.
So if I can, just to make sure I'm understanding correctly, so what I'm hearing you say is that care can and should be institutionalized.
Yes.
And it's in the institutionalization of care that that is the gateway to the road to national glory, if one can be a little poetic about it.
Yes. I think a nation's glory, a country's glory or pride, maybe that sounds a little, you know, better, runs through institutionalizing care.
Brian, you want to jump in with a quick?
Yeah, I just help me understand, therefore, the profound opposition to the Affordable Care Act that we saw during the Obama administration.
Yeah, it's because, I mean, so if one considers or thinks or has the sense that many of people who are just living in the United States aren't real Americans, and their having healthcare will take years away, you'll oppose the Affordable Care Act. And that maps on very easily, if I may, to the interests of very powerful institutions that don't care at all about care and that consider the granting of care to be an expense, to be limited. To overcome that, one needs to, I think, just sort of build a space or an institute or a practice where actually we're not going to allow a person living with us to have their body fail them or have their love fail them, and then say that is to prevent that or to help that person manifest the country's glory and it gives honor to the country.
So I'm looking at the time here, and I'm seeing that we're about at the limit of we're all going to hit Zoom fatigue soon. Is basically what I'm trying to say here. So ordinarily, I would now ask for a round of applause for our panelists, but since there can't really, what is the sound of two hands clapping on Zoom is the new koan for the age. But I would ask everyone here to for a moment and just to feel a little bit of appreciation for all of the hard work and preparation that has come, that has been poured into making this conversation possible, which has mattered a great deal to me. I've learned a lot. So with that, I'm going to express on behalf of the Thomas More Institute and everyone here, Professor Opal, thank you so much for your time and for your investment of energy in this conversation.
Absolutely a pleasure. It was really lovely to be with you tonight.
Carol, Brian, I know how much energy and attention you devoted to those questions. They were wonderful prompts. Thank you so much for everything that you've given tonight.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Wow.
And then finally, I'm going to ask, well, Zoe, can I ask you to show yourself for a second? Are you ready? This is the woman behind the curtain who made it all possible tonight. So this is our Administrative Services Coordinator, Zoe Shaw. Zoe, thank you so much for all that you did. That is invisible to almost everybody, but I certainly saw it all. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It was not possible without you. And then finally, a plug. So the courses are offered at the Thomas More Institute almost the entire year round. And we have courses coming up for the winter and spring sessions. And you can find those on our website, which is thomasmore.qc.ca. And I want to draw your attention, Carol and Brian have actually designed a course, which is entitled An American Experiment, Liberty, Equality, and Democracy in the United States. And this is only the first part of the course, 1492 to 1877. And it's based on the book, Brian, you want to point to it right above your left shoulder, These Truths by Jill Lepore, which was a finalist for the Cunhill Prize last year. And I highly recommend that you take a look at that on our website. It could be very interesting. I also want to say that in keeping with the Institute's commitment to conversations that matter, we aim to have another interview, similar format. We're aiming for late February. The details haven't been nailed down yet, but this one will be connected with issues related to promoting justice and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples here in Canada. So if you're not on our mailing list, you might want to consider signing up for it. And speaking of that, we're going to be sending out a very brief survey right after this event, which we would ask you to complete. And one of the things we would be inviting you to do is to sign up for that mailing list. And can't emphasize enough that your candid feedback, and I want to emphasize candid, really helps us improve our programming. Tell us what you think. We want to hear from you. And then finally, and not least importantly, you need to know that we at the Thomas More Institute strive to generate conversations that matter, and we do so only with the support of our partners and our funders. And those include the Government of Quebec, our partner is Bishop's University, and of course, we are powered by hundreds of volunteers and donors. If you enjoyed this interview, if you would like to see more of this kind of vigorous and original thinking, if you care about conversations that really matter and you want to see more of them, please consider making a gift or more to TMI to support our work. And with that, I will bid you all a very good night, a wonderful weekend. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Jonathan, for your excellent work as a Master of Ceremonies.
Absolutely.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you.